Welcome, everybody. I'm Adam Goodhart, director of the CV Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience, and I am very happy to welcome you here to the first of a three-part series with historical rock star Richard Beeman, and it is called Meet the Founders. I know that many of you here in the room attended and very much enjoyed the lecture series that Dr. Beeman offered here last fall, Inventing a Nation. And when I say that Dr. Beeman is a rock star, I mean literally last year during this series he couldn't walk around Chestertown without adoring mobs sort of clutching at the hems of his garments. That's not an exaggeration. So anyway, you will know what I mean when I tell you that we were just thrilled when Dr. Beeman agreed to return this year and offer a sequel. Now, in trying to make sense of a complicated past, we often focus on large, depersonalized forces, cultural and intellectual trends, demographic shifts, economic transitions. The question of how much any one man's or woman's individual actions and personality can change the course of human events is a matter that has bedeviled both historians and philosophers for quite a long time. But today and in the weeks ahead, we'll hear how our own nation's political system was and to some degree remains the product of a remarkable group of intellects and personalities, the men we collectively refer to as the founders. You're going to hear much more about them in just 1 minute. But first, let me tell you about the founding father of this series. Dr. Richard Beeman is one of the nation's leading historians of Americans' revolutionary and early national experience. A member of the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania for 44 years, I think almost since Benjamin Franklin left the building, something like that. For 44 years, Dr. Beeman has served as chair of the Department of History and Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences there at Penn. He's a member of the Scholarly Advisory Board of the American Revolution Center and the Board of Trustees of the National Constitution Center, and a former editor of American Quarterly, the journal of record for scholars in American Studies. Dr. Beeman is the author of 6 books, including The Penguin Guide to the American Constitution and Patrick Henry, a Biography, which was a finalist for the National Book Award in 1974. His 2009 book, Plain Honest Men, The Making of the American Constitution, won our very own George Washington Book Prize, garnering acclaim from the jurors who praised it as, and I quote them, the fullest and most authentic account of the Constitutional Convention ever written. The book also won the Athenaeum of Philadelphia Literary Award. Over the course of his career, Dr. Beeman has received numerous other distinctions, including fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and the Huntington Library. He has served as a Fulbright Professor in the United Kingdom and Harmsworth Distinguished Professor of American History at Oxford University. And I am especially proud to say, and I hope Dr. Beeman is too, that there is now an addition to that august list of institutions, because for the past 2 years he has been a member of our very own Washington College community as a senior fellow of the CV Starr Center, as well as of our own Institute for Religion, Politics, and Culture. And in this role, he has not only offered and created some extraordinary public programs like the one last year and the one that begins tonight, but also provided generous mentorship for some of our high-achieving students in history, political science, and other fields. As with last year's series, the format of Meet the Founders is flexible and can accommodate both repeat and one-time attendees. Those of you who can attend multiple sessions, we encourage you to approach Meet the Founders as a kind of mini college seminar, although there will be no tests, no papers, you'll be glad to hear. However, those of you who can only make it to 1 or 2 are also encouraged to attend. I think you'll find that they work as standalone talks as well. Details of the upcoming events in the series on November 7th and November 14th can be found in the programs that you should all have or that you can collect on the way out. So we hope you'll join us for those. We are very glad that you have joined us for this one, and I hope that you'll join me in welcoming Richard Beeman.
Thank you so much, Adam. You know, I love Washington College. I love Chestertown. I had such a great time last year doing this, so I truly am delighted to be back. Last year, I kind of bounced back and forth between past and present, which I do very much like to do. This year, I decided to, even though I know our heads are filled with the present right now, given the current presidential campaign, but I decided that I really would dive back into the 18th century. The lecture series has been billed as Meet the Founders, but if truth in advertising is to prevail, I have to tell you that it really should be entitled Meet a Few of the Founders, and indeed that it's really about just a few important moments in the political lives of those few founders. And I'll confess, too, that my choices about which of those individuals I'm going to talk about has been purely subjective, although I do like to think that there's some method behind my choices. I will say that there's a whole kind of intellectual issue about who are the founders. And in writing this lecture, I'd written an introduction ruminating on who are the founders. Not only men, but women, not only dead wealthy white males, but ordinary Americans. And when that preface reached about 20 pages, I decided, no, I can't do this. So you'll just have to take my word for it that I have some complex thoughts about who the founders are, and I'll be happy to delve into that in the question and answer session afterward. So tonight I've chosen John Adams, Tom Paine, and Thomas Jefferson. I Googled these folks and the images, and I think this is an older image of John Adams than I'd like to have, because I'm going to be talking to him during the period from 1774 to 76. That's pretty much the only kind of devilish image that we have of Tom Paine, and that's kind of the way I like to think of him. And I think Jefferson, too, I like his red hair in this one, but I think he might, too, because he was only 33 years old at the time of the writing of the Declaration, that he might have been a little younger, too. But that was the best I could do. I've chosen them as the subjects of this first talk, because I believe that they were the three individuals who were most influential in shaping America's epical, but also torturous and painful decision for independence in July of 1776. And also, not coincidentally, because I'm in the final stages of completing a book focusing on the 22 months between the convening of the First Continental Congress in September of 1774 and the adoption of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, a book that I hope will be in the bookstores in time for any Father's Day gifts that people are looking for. But I also chose these three men because in their personalities and political ideologies, they were very different from one another. Although they may have united in the common cause of independence from Great Britain, they're useful as illustrations of the fact that America's common cause, whether in 1776 or 2012, turns out to be a very wide umbrella under which men and women of very different political philosophies and temperaments can stand. And this will be a recurring theme in all of these lectures, the ways in which Americans of different personalities and different ideologies have been ultimately able to find common ground when it really mattered. Perhaps a lesson for our own times. I have to indulge, I guess, my own, I don't think it's a political bias, but my own very strong feelings. As my wife and I were driving up to our hotel this afternoon, the Imperial Hotel on High Street, there is a Republican campaign headquarters right next door. And truly, believe me, I know that all of you of good, are people of good faith, whether Romney supporters or Obama supporters. But there was a big poster in their window that said, "Vote for freedom," and then it had Romney and the Statue of Liberty, and Obama and a hammer and sickle. And that struck me as maybe a little outside that umbrella. so that if there are some lessons that we can learn from the struggles that these folks had, is that ultimately it really does make sense to work pretty hard to find that common cause. In any case, all right, now I get to the history part. But it really did strike me. So I begin with John Adams, for he was the first to enter the fray that would result in the decision for independence. And to some considerable extent, it was the force of his personality that shaped his relationship with the other two, Tom Paine and Thomas Jefferson. Whether out of deference to Adams' passion about the revolutionary cause, or simply because Adams was so much more voluble in his emotional and pathetically egocentric recording of the events of this period, much but not all of what you're going to hear this evening about these three important men does have a kind of John Adams-centric focus. I'm actually going to begin Adams' story at the end of my story in July of 1776. On the evening of July 2nd, 1776, a jubilant John Adams sat down at his desk in Sarah Yard's boarding house on the corner of 2nd and Market Streets in Philadelphia and wrote to Abigail, sharing with her his sense of the importance of the events of that day. Just a few hours earlier, the Second Continental Congress had agreed to a resolution affirming, and I quote, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Adams rejoiced, and I quote, in the suddenness as well as the greatness of this revolution. And he went on to proclaim that it is the will of heaven that these two countries should be sundered forever. On July 3rd, still in a state of jubilation, John wrote Abigail again, predicting, and I quote, that the second day of July 1776 will be the most memorable epocha in the history of America. I'm apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the Great Anniversary Festival. Of course, his prediction about the date of the Great Anniversary Festival was off by a couple of days for the July 4th adoption of the work of his congressional colleague, Thomas Jefferson, would eventually become the focus of those celebrations. But whatever Adams' miscalculation about the timing of our Great Anniversary Festival, he was certainly correct in predicting that the decisions made during those days in early July would reverberate through the ages. In the decades following the adoption of the Declaration, as 4th of July celebrations became an important American ritual, it has become commonplace for American politicians and civic leaders to mount the speaker's rostrum, to invoke the will of heaven, to depict the American Revolution and the creation of a democratic American nation that came into being in the aftermath of the Revolution as part of a divine plan, the inevitable result of the efforts of a virtuous citizenry dedicated to freedom. In retrospect, it may seem that America's decision for independence, whether directed by the will of heaven or through some other more prosaic but equally inexorable force, was somehow inevitable. But it seemed anything but inevitable at the time. So now I want to take you back 22 months to the beginning of the Continental Congress on September 5th, 1774. Adams had arrived in Philadelphia with the Massachusetts delegation. His older cousin Sam, Thomas Cushing, and Robert Treat Paine on August 29th. It would be John Adams' first trip outside of his home colony of Massachusetts. And though he had developed a respectable reputation as a lawyer and increasingly as a defender of American liberties within Massachusetts, he was, to his chagrin, anything but a well-known figure outside of his colony. To give you some sense of how much John Adams craved recognition, let me just give you a small sample of the avalanche of introspection and self-loathing and self-congratulation that we find in his diary at the time. He yearned, in his own words, to rise above the common herd of mankind. He was obsessed with what it would take to become a great man, one who might achieve immortality in the memories of all the worthy. But then, realizing his excessive ambition, he would berate himself for affectation and ostentation, adding, "I have insensibly fallen into habits of affecting wit and humor, of shrugging my shoulders, of moving and distorting the muscles of my face. My motions are stiff and uneasy, ungraceful, and my attention is unsteady and irregular. These are reflections on myself that I make. They're faults, defects, fopperies, and follies, and disadvantages." He then asked himself, "Can I mend these faults and supply these defects?" From the tone of his diary, it didn't seem likely. But then the very next week, the ambition returned and the self-reproach faded. He predicted, "I will attempt some uncommon, unexpected enterprise. Let me lay the plan and arouse spirit enough to push boldly. I swear I will push myself into business. I will watch my opportunity to speak in court and will strike with surprise. Surprise, bench, bar, jury, auditors, and all. Activity, boldness, forwardness will draw attention." Oh, it was not easy being John Adams. In contrast to John's relatively slight reputation outside of Massachusetts, his older cousin Sam had developed a reputation throughout America as a leader of radical, even violent resistance to British oppression. Some thought much too radical opposition. And indeed, this would be one of the central battles in the upcoming Continental Congress between so-called radicals like Sam Adams and more conservative delegates, particularly those from the colonies of Pennsylvania and New York, with Maryland, as you'll see, being on the fence. As the Congress began its work, there was little agreement among the delegates about what the very purpose of the Congress should be, other than to craft some form of protest against the passage of the Coercive Acts. This was a set of parliamentary laws aimed primarily at punishing Boston and the colony of Massachusetts for their consistent resistance to British policy, the most immediate provocation for those acts being the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773, which was generally believed to have been orchestrated by Sam Adams, with his cousin John standing by as an observer. But the principal impetus behind the calling of a Congress in response to those acts actually came from these conservative New Yorkers and Pennsylvanians. They hoped to slow the American resistance down a bit by calling for a Congress that they hoped would be composed by the best, brightest, and most conservative or most deliberative American political leaders. But they would quickly discover that the Congress was moving in a different direction. From the moment of his arrival in Philadelphia, it would be John, not Sam Adams, who pushed the assembled delegates most ardently to take bold steps. Interestingly, Sam Adams, perhaps because he was aware of the suspicions that many had of him as a dangerous radical, Sam Adams really kept in the background during the Congress. Richard Stockton of New Jersey would later refer to John as the Atlas of Independence, a designation which Adams was very pleased to accept. But a good many of his congressional colleagues might have chosen some other words with which to describe this voluble, talkative, and opinionated colleague. To many, on many occasions, he could be obnoxious, self-righteous, and self-absorbed. Quite simply, a good many of his congressional colleagues on many occasions were tempted to wring his neck. Adams poured out his heart and soul, both in his diary and in his letters home to his wife Abigail. His outpourings to Abigail, I would note, were direct violations of the oath of secrecy that all delegates had taken regarding the Congress's proceedings. But that didn't stop him, thank goodness, because we really do have this full account from John Adams. And his outpourings would swing back and forth in a kind of manic depressive description of his fellow delegates. One day he would describe the assembled delegates as a collection of the greatest men upon this continent in point of abilities, virtues, and fortunes. And then on the next day he would describe the delegates as a gathering of strangers and go on to rant, and I quote, that the art and address of ambassadors from a dozen belligerent powers of Europe, nay, of a conclave of cardinals in the election of a pope, or the princes in Germany at the choice of an empire, would not exceed the specimens we have seen in this Congress. Adams' opinions about the character of the Congress and its delegates would usually vary in direct correlation to the extent to which the delegates were agreeing to the proposals that he was putting before them. Thus, in the midst of the debate on the precise definition of American rights under the so-called British Constitution, when the delegates began to differ on whether the colonists' natural rights should be included, which was an important matter, for ultimately the decision for independence was based on an appeal to natural rights, Adams complained, and I quote again, "Our business is drawn and spun out to an immeasurable length. I believe that if it was moved and seconded that we should come to a resolution that 3 and 2 make 5, we should be entertained with logic and rhetoric, law, history, politics, and mathematics concerning the subject for 2 whole days." What he did not mention to Abigail, of course, was that the person doing most of the talking in those days was none other than John Adams. Yet at every stage in the process, Adams, through a combination of determination, high intelligence, impressive knowledge of law and political philosophy, Adams was able to push his agenda forward. Whether in the drafting of a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which essentially amounted to a complete denial of all British political authority over the American colonies, or in the adoption of a Continental Association calling for a complete and very strictly enforced boycott of all trade with Great Britain, or in the adoption of a resolution calling for Massachusetts to put itself in a state of defense, Adams helped transform a body that many had hoped would be a genteel debating society into America's first Continental Legislature, following an agenda that, far from encouraging reconciliation, would move the colonies closer to the decision for independence. The first Congress adjourned in late October of 1774, with John writing to Abigail that it's not very likely that I shall ever see this part of the world again, a monumentally mistaken prediction. When he returned to Philadelphia for the meeting of the Second Congress in May of 1775, America's relationship with England had changed dramatically. America, or at least Massachusetts, was at war with England following the battles of Lexington and Concord. Whereas the task of the First Continental Congress was to protest the coercive acts and to define America's rights and grievances, the task of the Second Congress was to simultaneously to defend the colonies militarily and to see if there was any way short of independence that would enable America to settle her grievances with Parliament, and now a king that seemed determined to impose their will by force if necessary. Within days after its appointment of George Washington as commander of a newly formed Continental Army, the Congress learned of the Battle of Bunker Hill, a battle so devastating that it became more and more difficult to regard the military conflict with England as little more than isolated skirmishes. John Adams' mood at this time was typically complicated and egotistical. On the one hand, he was a strong supporter of Washington's appointment as the commander of the Continental Army. In fact, there is, I think, a kind of phony historical argument about whether it was a close decision to appoint Washington as commander of the Continental Army. I don't think it was close at all. I think it was a very obvious decision. But if you listen to John Adams, it all depended on his eloquent arguments in favor of George Washington that resulted in Washington's appointment. And he did have a great deal of affection and respect for Washington. But on the other hand, he could not help but complain about all the attention that Washington was getting. On the day that Washington rode off from Philadelphia toward Boston, Adams again wrote to Abigail describing the pomp and ceremony surrounding the general's departure. Complaining, I love this quote, "Such is the pride and pomp of war. I, poor creature, worn out with scribbling for my bread and my liberty, low in spirits and weak in health, I just leave others to wear the laurels which I have sown, others to eat the bread which I have earned." By the summer of 1775, I think both John and Sam Adams had decided that reconciliation with England was impossible and that independence was the only alternative. And between the summer of 1775 and January of 76, John in particular would constantly push the delegates in the Congress in that direction, sometime to his considerable frustration, getting a lot of pushback from most of his fellow delegates. At that point, the only colonies in December of 1776, December of 75 or January of 76, the only colonies prepared to make that leap toward independence were Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, possibly Connecticut, possibly Virginia, not even a majority of the colonies. Again, reading Adams' writings, where he continues to spill the beans and violate the oath of secrecy in his letters home to Abigail, one can see his frustration growing. And reading the letters of some of Adams' adversaries, particularly those from New York, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina, one can see their growing annoyance with him. Unlike his supposedly more radical cousin Sam, who realized that it really was necessary to achieve unanimity among the colonies if independence was going to be successful, John Adams was hardly likely to go down in history as a patient man. In January of 76, John Adams' quest to convince Americans that independence was the only alternative got a huge boost from an unlikely source, indeed from a source almost wholly unknown to him. I think, in fact, at that moment, entirely unknown to him. In November of 1774, an impoverished, mostly self-educated, and very angry English immigrant arrived in Philadelphia. Thomas Paine had encountered little other than failure and rejection in his native England before his arrival on American shores. The son of a Quaker staymaker, which is to say that his father was a maker of corsets, those contraptions composed of leather or linen, which with their ribs of steel or whalebone laced together on the sides with ribbon enabled or constrain the women of 18th century England to present themselves as amply bosomed. Tom Paine very reluctantly took up his father's trade. But despising the boredom of that job, he worked off and on as a collector of English customs duties until he was fired from his job for trying to organize his fellow customs collectors to protest against their low wages. I have to tell you, I have a special fondness for Tom Paine, and I'm frustrated here because I'm condensing his early career into just a few sentences. But as a professor teaching the American History Survey course at the University of Pennsylvania, for decades now, I've been dressing up as Tom Paine and doing an hour-long interpretation of Tom Paine, including the heavy drinking that he did along the way. In any case, when he landed in Philadelphia with a brief note of introduction from Benjamin Franklin, whom he had met briefly in London, no one could have imagined that he would write a pamphlet that would change the world. For about a year before the publication of Common Sense, Paine had worked for a startup journal, the Pennsylvania Magazine, writing essays on a wide variety of topics, ranging from political tracts on things like the evils of aristocracy or the immorality of slavery, or indeed on the rights of women. In my impersonation, I say, I was the first feminist, because he does have this tract on the rights of women. But he also wrote ordinary stuff, advice to the lovelorn columns, for example. And then on January 10, 1776, common sense hit the streets of Philadelphia. Much of the debate in the Continental Congress up to that time had revolved around the question of how Americans could persuade the English Parliament and ultimately the King to return to the, quote, true principles of the English Constitution. The Americans' disagreement with their English counterparts on what those true principles were was growing more and more acrimonious. But nearly all Americans continued to believe that this unwritten English Constitution was the standard for what was good and true. Paine would have none of that. He started Common Sense with an attack on the English Constitution. The so much boasted Constitution of England, Paine wrote, may have been noble for the dark and slavish times in which it was erected, but that it is imperfect, subject to convulsions, and incapable of producing what it seems to promise is easily demonstrated. And with that contemptuous dismissal, he embarked on a passionate attack on the very institutions that lay at the heart of that Constitution, reserving his greatest ire for the institution to which most Americans, even in January of '76, still felt their greatest loyalty, the English monarchy. There is something exceedingly ridiculous, he observed, in the composition of the monarchy. It first excludes a man from the means of information, yet empowers him in cases where the highest judgment is required. He continued his assault with a discourse on equality. Mankind being originally equal in order of creation, he wrote, the equality could only be destroyed by subsequent circumstances. Acknowledging with regret that inequality that existed between rich and poor, Paine went on to condemn another even greater distinction, for which no truly natural or religious reason can be assigned, and that is the distinction of men into kings and subjects. And he then embarked on a survey of the history of the monarchy, ridiculing it as the most prosperous invention the devil ever set on foot for the promotion of idolatry. Following this wrathful survey of the sins and savage manners of kings throughout the ages, he ended with his assessment of the English monarchy. England, since the conquest, hath known some few good monarchs, but grown beneath a much larger number of bad ones. Yet no man in his senses can say that their claim under William the Conqueror is a very honorable one. A French bastard landing with an armed banditti and establishing himself king of England against the consent of the natives, it is in plain terms a very paltry, rascally original. It certainly hath no divinity in it. And King George III, the royal brute of England, he called him, was among the worst of the lot. Even brutes, Paine wrote, do not devour their young, nor savages make war on their families. In what is perhaps the most stirring passage in Common Sense, Paine looked to the future, to the opportunities that Americans had to form, and I quote, the noblest, purest Constitution on the face of the earth. And he went on to write, we have it in our power to begin the world over again. The birthday of a new world is at hand, and a race of men perhaps as numerous as all Europe contains are to receive their portion of freedom from the event of just a few months. Tom Paine, unlike John Adams or Thomas Jefferson, was a true radical. He wished not merely to return to the true principles of the English Constitution. He wanted to start all over again. He wanted to give the American people the opportunity literally to invent an entirely new and more noble form of government. America, indeed the world, had never seen anything like Common Sense. The pamphlet sold more than 100,000 copies within 3 months of its publication, perhaps as many as 250,000 within its first 6 months, now all over the world. And its impact went beyond its sales. It caused a fundamental transformation in Americans' thinking about both their relationship with their mother country and their identity as Americans. As one Connecticut reader observed, you have declared the sentiments of millions. Your production may justly be compared to a land flood that sweeps before it. We were blind, but on reading these enlightening words, the scales have fallen from our eyes. And truly, that was the revolutionary character of Common Sense. Before Tom Paine wrote Common Sense, most Americans were earnestly defending their liberties as Englishmen. But after its publication, more and more of the subjects of King George III were beginning to imagine an entirely different future as independent Americans. As important as all of John Adams' efforts to persuade his colleagues in the Continental Congress to take that leap toward independence may have been, nothing was more important in persuading the American people of that fact than the American people, as opposed to just the delegates in the Congress. Nothing was more important than common sense. And Adams, at least initially, recognized the pamphlet's worth, writing to Abigail after he'd first seen it that he thought it would soon become the common faith. But by April and May of 1776, when Paine's work had become a runaway bestseller, Adams began to mix his grudging approval with sniping criticism. In point of argument, there's nothing really new, he commented. Indeed, Adams would claim that Common Sense was downright unoriginal, a mere summary of the arguments which I had been repeating again and again in Congress for 9 months. Now, really, this assessment was preposterously wide of the mark. Adams had indeed been a vigorous advocate of independence inside the walls of the Pennsylvania State House, but his arguments, even in that closed forum, were more legalistic than Paine's. Whatever the depth of his intellect or the passion of his beliefs, Adams never was able to put together an argument in favor of independence in which the whole equaled more than the sum of the parts. Common Sense, by contrast, really did go right straight to the minds and the hearts of Americans. Some of Adams' disparagement of Paine's work, no doubt, came from the simple fact that their personalities and temperaments really did spring from very different sources. The Braintree, Massachusetts Puritan and the newly arrived English immigrant. Adams could not resist noting, for example, that Paine only seemed able to write after, and I quote, he had quickened his thoughts with large draughts of rum and water, a habit that contributed to what Adams called his intemperate writing style. In some, Adams pronounced Paine to be a bad character and not fit to be placed in any position of real responsibility. And unfortunately, he would never let go of that hostility. In 1819, 10 years after Paine's death, writing to Thomas Jefferson, he was still complaining, "What a poor, ignorant, malicious, short-sighted, crapulous mass is Tom Paine's Common Sense." Had Adams' feelings about Common Sense be guided less by his personal egotism and more by a pragmatic desire to move his fellow Americans closer to the decision for independence, then he certainly should have put his reservations about any part of Paine's pamphlet about which he disagreed and embraced it more enthusiastically. For ultimately, of course, they really were on the same side. So maybe Adams in 1819 had also stepped outside that wide umbrella and that very harsh assessment of Paine. Our final character this evening, Thomas Jefferson, like Tom Paine, entered the revolutionary drama fairly late in the game. Although he'd been a strong supporter of of America's constitutional rights since his first election to the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1769, he was almost to the moment when he first arrived in Philadelphia in June of 1775, pretty much of a backbencher in the House of Burgesses, a body in which so many other distinguished Virginians were serving. Indeed, it was only with the departure from the Congress of men like Patrick Henry and George Washington that Jefferson was included in the Virginia delegation as a kind of alternate to those departed delegates. I'd note, for example, in the balloting for the delegates to the First Continental Congress, Jefferson only finished ninth in the balloting. Once Jefferson arrived in Philadelphia in June of 75, he proved a strong supporter of John Adams' militant position. But then he left to go back home to Monticello in December, and because of the death of his mother, and then because of some issues with his own health, he seemed to have developed a bout of what were probably migraine headaches. Jefferson actually did not return to Philadelphia until May 14th of 1776. Just a little more than 3 weeks after his return, his Virginia colleague, Richard Henry Lee, introduced a resolution formally proposing independence. Although the Congress decided to defer further discussion of Lee's resolution until July 1st, they also decided, and I quote, "In order that no time be lost in case the resolution shall be adopted," they decided to create a committee to draft a declaration justifying that action. On June 11th, the delegates voted for members of that committee. Jefferson was not only elected to serve on the committee, but as the person receiving the highest number of votes, he was chosen chair of the committee, which in addition to Jefferson consisted of, and this is the point at which I should have the wholly mythological Jonathan Trumbull painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which has the committee of five up there at the front. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston of New York joining Jefferson. So how was it that Jefferson, a relative newcomer to the Congress, he'd really only served there less than 6 months, and far less known even in Virginia than many of the more activist politicians in that colony, and by most accounts, a poor public speaker. Once again, we can count on John Adams here, who said of Jefferson's speaking abilities, "During the whole time I sat with him in Congress, I never heard him utter 3 sentences together." The only speech of consequence that Adams could remember was one in which Jefferson uttered, I quote, "a gross insult on religion, for which I gave him immediately the reprehension which he richly merited." So how was it that Jefferson was elected chair of the committee to draft the Declaration? The answer to that question does shed some light on Jefferson's personality and talents. He was not at that stage in his career, he was 33 years old at the time, he was not a dominant public personality. But by most accounts, he was far more impressive in small groups, the sort of groups that would have gathered at Philadelphia's City Tavern to discuss the cascading course of events that the delegates were confronting. And he was really smart. Not just clever, not quick-witted. John Adams was both of those, although his cleverness and wit could easily turn pretty nasty. Jefferson was deeply intelligent. In 1774, he had written a lengthy treatise on America's constitutional relationship with Great Britain, and he had introduced it into the Virginia House of Burgesses. But that body thought it was too radical and didn't act on it. But some friends of Jefferson's sent it to a Virginia printer who published it under the title of a summary view of the rights of British America. And it was circulated all across America. It became far more influential out of doors, being read by people all across America than anything anyone, including Jefferson, had expected. So it was that display of his intellectual and literary gifts, perhaps more than anything else, that led to his very sudden ascendancy at that moment. The only extended description of the decision to have Jefferson actually write the Declaration is a rather famous one, and it comes, of course, from John Adams. In a recollection written late in his life, Adams wrote, and I quote, "When the committee first met, Mr. Jefferson desired me to make the draft. But Adams claimed he declined, insisting that Jefferson take on the task." Adams then listed the reasons that he gave to Jefferson. One, that he was a Virginian, and I a Massachusetts man. Two, that he was a Southern man, and I a Northern one. Three, that I had been so obnoxious from my early and constant zeal in promoting the measure that any draft of mine would undergo a more severe scrutiny and criticism in Congress than one of his composition. Fourthly and lastly, and that would be reason enough if there were no other, I had a great opinion of the elegance of his pen and none at all of my own. Now, Adams' first three reasons had a ring of truth to them. It was preferable to have someone from Virginia, America's oldest and most populous colony, rather than one of those radical New England fanatics, as they were sometimes viewed. And since the New England colonies were all solidly within the independence camp, and at least at the time that the committee was selected, Delaware's, Maryland's, and South Carolina's support of independence was in doubt, with New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey actually still being opposed. The selection of Jefferson was also a way to entrust the drafting of a representative of the southern rather than the northern colonies. And Adams was correct in recognizing that his zealousness in promoting the cause of independence had in fact rendered him obnoxious to at least some of the delegates in the Congress. The only part of his account that does not ring true was his recollection that he admitted to Jefferson that the elegance of Jefferson's pen was greater than his own. For Adams did have a very high opinion of his own abilities as a writer. Jefferson himself waited until 1823 to give his own version of events. Writing to James Madison, Jefferson insisted that Mr. Adams' memory has led him into unquestionable error. At the age of 88 and 47 years after the transaction of independence, that memory of his is not wonderful. Now, of course, at the age of 80, at the time he was writing to Madison, Jefferson was no spring chicken himself. But according to Jefferson, there was no exchange between he and Adams about who might be better qualified to produce a first draft of the Declaration. Quite simply, Jefferson recalled the members of the committee, quote, unanimously pressed upon myself alone to undertake the draft. I consented, I drew it. So there you have it. The story of Jefferson's drafting of the Declaration, and even more important, of the various editions, this is my only other PowerPoint, first of all, let me just say, the drafting of the Declaration of Independence is a fascinating subject on which I would love someday to give a whole lecture, and I am devoting actually 2 chapters of it in this book that I'm completing. It goes through 3 stages. The first stage is what you see here, which is Thomas Jefferson himself writing out the Declaration in longhand and then going over it and making some additions and corrections. Here's all 4 pages of it. And then he gives that draft to members of the committee. And John Adams and Benjamin Franklin in particular make a number of emendations and suggestions on that draft, some of which Jefferson accepts, some of which we do not. But since all of those changes are in Jefferson's handwriting, we don't really know who made what suggestions. Although, again, if you listen to John Adams, he made most of the suggestions. But then the draft, that second draft of the Constitution, called the original draft, goes to the Congress itself. And they make a lot of really extensive additions and bits of editing to that document. There really are 2 drafts of our Declaration of Independence. There's Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, and there's America's Declaration of Independence. And historians are generally agreed that the final draft of the Declaration, however wonderful Jefferson's original draft was, that the final draft is more effective and more eloquent than Jefferson's original. The Congress did little to change the wording of the famous preamble, but they did, and unfortunately, I really tried to get a good graphic description that you could look at of Congress's emendations, but I just didn't have the technological skills to do it. But Congress is really, cutting all over the place. They're drawing lines through lots of Jefferson's prose, particularly in the main body of the draft, the list of specific grievances, toning down some of his more inflammatory rhetoric, and perhaps most notably, eliminating a very lengthy passage in the Declaration denouncing the British for instituting the slave trade. It's a fascinating section of the Declaration which was not included in the final draft. It is, I think, a sincere moral denunciation of slavery. But there was also, of course, a great deal of hypocrisy in it, in that it was not exactly fair to blame the British themselves entirely for foisting slaves upon American slave owners. I believe that American slave owners, including Jefferson, anteed up some money to purchase those slaves. So there's some very interesting changes that the Congress makes to the Declaration. Another kind of interesting change they make is that they do at the end of the Declaration add a couple of references to the deity, one to the deity and the other to divine providence, which Jefferson really did not want in there. But in general, I think it's the collective view of most scholars who've studied this that the final draft of the Declaration is more concise and more elegant than Jefferson's original. But Jefferson was of a different opinion, and indeed he proved a rather thin-skinned author. He complained to all who would listen about the mutilations from which his original draft had suffered. And he was sufficiently upset by the additions and deletions from his draft that he wrote out in hand multiple copies of his original draft and sent them to friends in Virginia, asking them whether it is better or worse for the critics. Richard Henry Lee, a recipient of one of those copies, responded to Jefferson saying that he personally wished the manuscript had not been mangled as it has been. But Lee's response was probably prompted more by a desire to be polite to his Virginia colleague than a really candid response. The final product, America's Declaration of Independence, was, I think, was superior, more concise, more constrained, and perhaps even more elegant than the original. So, what did Jefferson's two revolutionary compatriots, John Adams and Tom Paine, think of the document? Interestingly, neither Jefferson nor Tom Paine ever commented at any length on the other's work. Jefferson was almost certainly pleased with the impact of common sense on American public opinion, and over the course of the next few decades, Jefferson and Paine did develop a cordial, if not a close, relationship. But if Paine had been asked to write the Declaration of Independence, it would have been a very different document. Jefferson, though temperamentally given to some radical outbursts, was in his intellectual training relatively conservative, although that's really not the right word. I think the word really is lawyerly. And the Declaration, in spite of the eloquence of the preamble, is a very legalistic document, a long bill of indictment against the king for violating the true principles of that unwritten English Constitution. And while the ultimate logic of the Declaration takes the readers to a higher law, that of the natural rights of men, but Jefferson's interpretation of the English Constitution remains the highest standard of good government for him, even in the Declaration of Independence. By contrast, as I mentioned earlier, Paine really was America's true radical. He wished to cast aside virtually every feature of that English Constitution as corrupt, and to begin the task of creating a government from the beginning. We have it in our power to begin the world over again, to create an entirely new frame of government. Paine, because he admired and respected Jefferson, never made those differences public, but on some level he must have known that he and Jefferson were approaching the subject of independence from different perspectives. And then there's our buddy John Adams. As was so often the case, his assessment was torn between an appreciation of Jefferson's accomplishments and a jealousy that his own contributions were not sufficiently recognized. In a remarkable letter that he wrote to Benjamin Rush in 1809, Adams lamented, "Mausoleums, statues, monuments, they will never be erected to me. Panegyrical romances will never be written, nor flattering orations spoken to transmit me to posterity in brilliant colors." And it was that conviction that he would never receive history's due until David McCulloch finally gave it to him. That he would never receive history's due that caused him to have such mixed feelings about Jefferson's declaration. In a letter that he wrote to his Massachusetts colleague Timothy Pickering, he praised Jefferson's declaration in one sentence, expressing his utter delight with the high tone and flights of oratory with which it abounded. But then in the next paragraph, he complained, there's not a new idea in it, but what has been hackneyed in Congress in the 2 years before, the substance of it is contained in the Declaration of Rights in the Journal of Congress in 1774, which of course he had written. Fortunately, at the moment of his death, on July 4th, 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the more generous side of Adams emerged. As most of you know, Adams was not the only American to pass from that scene on that anniversary day. His colleague, his occasionally bitter political enemy, and then in the final years of his life, his dear friend and extraordinarily creative correspondent, Thomas Jefferson, also left the world that day. Jefferson's and Adams' relationship over the years had been a tumultuous one. Allies during the years of the Revolution, bitter political enemies during the 1790s when each was the leader of opposing political parties, then cutting off all communication with one another for a dozen years after Jefferson's election as president in 1800. And it wasn't until Benjamin Rush sort of arranged a kind of reconciliation between the two that they initiated a long and wonderful correspondence in which the two men, in spite of their many political and philosophical differences, found their common ground as Americans once again. Public officials had been planning for a huge celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in Washington, D.C., for many months before that day in July. But both Jefferson and Adams were not able to attend, and it was well known in advance that they would not be able to attend, knowing that their days were coming to an end. Jefferson lost consciousness on July 2nd, and though he woke briefly a couple of times during the next 48 hours, he quietly slipped away at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon on July 4th. Adams, true to form, though slipping in and out of consciousness, was more talkative. On June 30th, he was visited by a delegation of Bostonians asking him if he wished to have a toast read aloud at Massachusetts' own July 4th celebration. "Independence forever," he croaked. It was pretty much all downhill after that, except late in the afternoon on July 4th. With several people in the bedroom, he awakened and then whispered, "Thomas Jefferson survives." Then within an hour, Adams too made his departure from the earth. Truly, both Adams and Jefferson had, at the end, found their common ground. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, thank you. As usual, I'm happy to answer questions about anything, past or present. Yes, sir.
Dr. Beeman, what was the reaction to the publication of Common Sense in Europe?
Well, the British hated it and found it treasonous. I mean, its attack on the king was brutal, but it was widely read. I don't think we have precise records of publication circulation, but I think this was the most widely circulated thing ever printed up to that time. So it was certainly read and would have, of course, a great impact subsequently during the French Revolution as well. It didn't, though, it didn't persuade the British people. The Americans, wrote these petitions to Parliament and to the King, trying to get them to see their interpretation of the English Constitution as being the proper one, and they were rebuffed. They also tried to go over the heads of the King and the Parliament and write addresses to the British people, but the British people were not sympathetic to the American cause. So I suspect it was read more out of curiosity than by being embraced. Yes, sir?
Sort of a thought, the hesitancy of Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, to some extent Delaware and South Carolina. Looking rather ahead, those were the major battlefields.
That's right. Although the battlefields obviously started in Massachusetts, they were worried about that. But I think it was more that the dominant political leaders of New York, Pennsylvania, and to a lesser extent South Carolina were all men of a more conservative temperament, many of them wealthy merchants and lawyers who were doing quite well, thank you very much. They looked at the coercive acts as violations of American liberties. They weren't saying that they were good acts. But they also kind of said, if those New England fanatics hadn't pushed all this to such a great extent, maybe we wouldn't be in this mess. And that's why Sam Adams really is, in some ways, so much more impressive than John in the Continental Congress. Even though Sam Adams was the guy who got things rolling in Boston, he really knew that he was going to have to keep a low profile, and at City Tavern and the Indian Queen, he was the one talking politely to those delegates from the colonies that were on the fence. In Maryland, the guy who's the real hero is Samuel Chase of Maryland, who is an advocate of independence, but the Maryland legislature is dragging its heels. And this is like June 30th, July 1st. And what Samuel Chase does is organize a series of local meetings in which the people of Maryland express their views, which is to tell the legislature to vote in favor of independence. And then he sends the word, I think it's on July 1st, maybe even July 2nd, to Philadelphia to cast their vote in favor. Any other questions or numbed? Yes, sir.
We hear of South Carolina during this period, but we hear nothing of North Carolina.
Well, North Carolina in 1776, I think this is true. I got to be careful because there's a North Carolina expert in the audience. May have been the 4th or 5th most populous colony in all of America. A lot of that population coming south from Virginia, which is the most populous colony in America. Its political leaders do not have the kind of stature of a John or Edward Rutledge or a Henry Middleton, these fabulously wealthy rice planters who own hundreds of slaves. But North Carolina was on board with independence earlier than was South Carolina. South Carolina's delegation was kind of divided up until the very end. Yes?
England at the time would seem to have been a superpower.
Yeah.
Wasn't there a certain amount of trepidation that you create this instrument, they're going to come back and find you?
Yeah.
About government affairs.
Well, two responses to that. First of all, there is this myth that the Declaration of Independence was signed on the 4th of July with John Hancock's big signature at the top. In fact, it was not even engrossed on parchment until July 19th because New York had still abstained on independence on July 2nd because its legislature had not authorized its delegates to vote in favor. So it wasn't a real unanimous declaration until July 19th. And then the delegates kind of trickled in and signed it somewhere between the 1st of August, even into November. There's a New Hampshire delegate who wasn't even there to vote for independence, who signed the Declaration in November of 1776, and they didn't make their signatures public, I think, until a few months after that. So yes, there was this danger that they would be hung as, treasonous people. But the other thing that's even more striking to me is that in May and June of 1776, the British Navy appears in New York Harbor. And one, just really like right next to Brooklyn, and one soldier who is there says, it appears that all of London has suddenly arrived in New York. This fleet of 70 ships arrives in New York. America has no navy whatsoever at that point of time. And that's really what I mean about this decision not being inevitable. It was an audacious decision. And if you were living in New York and saw those ships, you'd be a little concerned. Washington, by the way, was in New York himself by that time. He realized that that was going to be the next field of battle. So, yeah, no, there's lots of reason to think that this might not work. Yes?
I'm wondering what effect did Jefferson's religious, or I should say irreligious views, which were such a big thing in the 1800 campaign against John Adams.
Yeah.
How did those views affect his standing during the Continental Congress days?
Well, Jefferson's religious, good question, complicated question. Jefferson's religious views were just beginning to be made known. He was beginning in the framing of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was a Bill of Rights which preceded our federal Bill of Rights by 13 years, to articulate notions of not only religious freedom, but a separation of church and state. He had not written extensively about his deistic views at that time, although Jefferson, I believe, was a deist in 1776. The preamble to the Declaration, I have a senior memory, so I keep forgetting, and my copy of the Declaration and Constitution is in my backpack. This seems to be a boarding pass on U.S. Airways. But in the preamble, he says, the laws of nature and of nature's God do, cause us to proclaim these unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The laws of nature and of nature's God. The brilliant intellectual historian of America and Europe, Carl Becker, said that in that passage, Thomas Jefferson deified nature and demystified God. So I think that those phrases were very Jeffersonian. Then there are two other phrases at the very end of the Declaration, which unfortunately I don't have with me and I can't remember the context of them, in which there are references to divine providence and the deity, and those were added by members of Congress because they were very anxious to have God on their side, after all. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, sir. Maybe.
What effect do you think that Thomas Paine and the American Revolution had on the French Revolution?
Oh, I think it had an enormous effect. I mean, it was the first people's revolution. People had been, John Locke had been writing about the theoretical right of the people to be the sources of governmental power and the theoretical right of people to tear down governments that were destructive of liberty, but the Americans were the ones who did it. So I think the impact was enormous. That is why, one of the many reasons he also liked living in France, why Jefferson was so fond of the French and was so attached to the French Revolution, even maybe after it no longer was such a good idea to be defending some aspects of that revolution. And of course, it was the reason why Tom Paine went to France during the French Revolution, although that cost him 11 months in a French jail because he too found himself on the wrong side of things at one point. Well, listen, I thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward. I hope to seeing many of you again 2 weeks from now. We can't do it next week because it's Halloween.